Good afternoon and welcome to the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center. My name is Susan Derwin and I'm the director of the IHC. As the public face of the humanities for the campus, our mission is to mount programs and support research that advances knowledge about human experience in social, historical, and cultural context. Much of our work takes place in the area of the public humanities through programs designed to empower community members as agents of social change. Today's event is sponsored by the IHC's Regeneration Series and the East Asia Center. We will be taking audience questions at the conclusion of the presentation. You can submit your questions to our speaker at any time through the question and answer function on your screen. We will do our best to answer as many of them as possible. A recording of this event will be posted to our website in the near future. Finally, before we begin our program, I would like to acknowledge the Chumash people, who are the traditional custodians of the land upon which the IHC is located, and I would like to pay respect to Chumash elders, past and present, as well as to other indigenous people present. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Monica Bethe is director of the Medieval Japanese Studies Institute in Kyoto. Her publications include numerous book chapters, most recently In Memorandum, Dragonflies and Drums, which is part of the new Cornell University Press collection, War and Memory in the Samurai Age. She's also a translator of books, such as Restoration of Japanese Art in European and American Collections, and her most recent journal article on costumes of the No Theater appeared last year in Mime Journal. We are delighted that Monica Bethe is taking part in the IHC's public events series on the theme of regeneration. And I want to extend my thanks to our colleague, Professor Kate Salzman-Lee, for bringing her work to our attention. For as we will learn today, the conservation of textiles is a generative and regenerative experience that entails the preservation of both the material object and the techniques used to create it. It's my great pleasure to welcome Monica Bethe to speak at the virtual IHC on Ensuring the Future of Historic Textiles, the case of a Japanese empress's court gown.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be able to participate in this program, which appears to be extremely meaningful on many, many different items. So I'm going to go directly into my speech now, if I can figure out the logistics. When I was asked to give this speech, there were many, many different topics that I thought I might possibly talk about, but the idea of regeneration seems to be particularly apt to the question of restoration and conservation. So my job at the Medieval Japanese Studies Institute in Kyoto focuses in part on finding items through research at these imperial convents that need some kind of restoration or conservation work done, and then getting the conservation work done, finding the money for it, and finding the people who are able to do the conservation work. So the particular piece that we have are dealing with this time is actually not all that old. It's much newer than most of the pieces that we tend to deal with. Before I get into introducing the court gown, which is going to be the topic of this lecture, I want to just review the idea of what do we do when we take some kind of old piece and say, this is really meaningful. I would like for it to be available to future generations. One thing you can do, particularly if it's in rubble, is to reproduce it, to research what it used to be like and to replicate it. Another thing you can do is to, if there's a little bit of it left, is to repair it and rebuild it, fill in the empty parts, and do what we call a restoration work. Finally, You could simply conserve that which remains. And a great deal of the museum-oriented work that's done these days focuses on conservation as opposed to reproduction or restoration. Conservation, which there are in the last century or so, people have changed their minds a great deal about what does it actually involve to do conservation. And the present approach is that you should add nothing and you should discard nothing. So whatever was missing in the original at the point where you have to do the conservation, you simply want to solidify it, you want to stabilize it, but you don't want to return it to the original, which would be a restoration work, the way it appeared when it first happened, but rather to leave it in its form there, but to stabilize it so that it doesn't disintegrate anymore. And the process of that involves matching materials so that they don't fight. If you conserve something and there's things that you are using to conserve it are stronger than the material that you're conserving, you're going to induce more deterioration. And the process, it also is an ongoing process of learning from the past and devising new solutions to figure out how to repair what remains. No matter whether it's a reproduction or a restoration or a conservation, it's extremely important that one focuses on the preservation of this so that it's maintained and sustained for the future. So that involves thinking a great deal about the atmospheric environment, water, air, light, all can cause deterioration in various types of substances. It also involves figuring out how to support things and what kinds of containers and what kind of handling should be used when dealing with the final object. So the piece that I'm going to talk to you about today is a robe that was worn by the Meiji Empress. Her name was Haruko, but after she stopped being Empress and started being Empress Dowager, she gets the name Shoken Kotaigo, and that's what most people refer to her as today. The Meiji period in Japan, which started in 1868 after Perry had opened the country, and there was a great deal of maybe about 10 years worth of civil war, where the Japanese couldn't decide whether they wanted to expel the barbarians or to embrace the barbarians. They finally overthrew the shogunate and they returned to rule by the imperial household, which had been there all the time. It goes back until time prehistory. And so therefore it's called the Meiji Restoration of the imperial rule. The Meiji emperor and his new young wife, Haruko, embarked then on the modernization of Japan. One of the things that Japan was dead set on was that it was not going to turn into a pawn of the Western countries and be totally colonized as its neighbors, for instance, China and Indonesia were. And so they figured, so as not to be colonized, they would have to be equal to the West. And they therefore adopted a lot of external and internal, or obvious and unobvious, forms of Westernization. And Westernization and modernization came hand in hand. The Meiji emperor there built himself a modern army, and he dressed them all in Western clothes with Western uniforms. And he himself started to dress, when he appeared publicly, in Western dress very early in the 1870s. But the women were still kept in the background and not put out in the public. But it became very clear that women in the West also accompanied their husbands and were much more active. And so there was as the Japanese started to create a constitution, because they said, we have to have a constitution like Western countries have a constitution that will prove to them that we are able to rule ourselves. That one of the things they had to do was to convince Haruko that she should dress like the Westerners. And this happened about not quite 20 years after the Meiji Restoration. And Haruko is much more, let's say, she's much more active and into the modernization process, actually, than her husband was. So the ministers went to her and they said, if we are going to be truly seen as equal to the West, you have to dress like a Westerner. And she acquiesces. They order the first set of garments for her and for various people surrounding her from Berlin, because they happen to have a particular affinity for the German Prussian style. And they want to make their constitution and their country modeled to a great extent on the Prussian style. So, and the first time she appears in the New Year's in a completely formal Western style court gown with a long train, like you just saw in the picture, is in 1887. But the moment she does that, then within weeks, she issues a dress manifesto where she tells the other people in the court that now for court functions, everybody has to dress in Western clothes. But those Western clothes should be made of Japanese materials. So when we can look at her transformation from what our Western eyes would say was a very exotic and very Oriental view on the left here, and her transformation then into someone who would appear perfectly naturally within a Western court. The photograph that's taken here was taken just after the promulgation of the Constitution in 1889, and was then distributed to a lot of the monarchies around the world. So it's a real PR photograph. So what happens to this gown? When was it made? Whatever. That's part of the story that I'm going to tell you today. But first I want to tell you why did it end up in a convent? And why this particular convent? So this dress that she wore about 15 years after, when she was older, and she said, I'm never going to wear pink again, basically, probably. She said, I don't need this anymore. I'm going to give it to one of the convents where in the past, daughters of the emperors were the abbesses of the convents. And that's a long history, which I won't go into now, but she gave it to Daishoji Convent, which is very close to where she grew up when she was a child in Kyoto. When the convent got it, they did exactly what they would have done with any other garment. They cut it in, they took the train, which is basically rectangular, and they cut it into 2 squares. And then they took the backing off and rebacked it and wrote a inscription on it, telling where it came from, that it was donated directly from the Empress, and when they made the altar cloth, and they turned it into an altar cloth. So what's an altar cloth? This is the altar in the temple in Daishoji Convent, where who owns that garment. And you can see that there are curtains around the outside, and then recessed, there's the altar area, and it has 3 triangular cloths hanging there. Those triangular cloths are the altar cloths, and they're squares, which are then hung into triangles when they're set up. Each one of those was once upon a time a garment that somebody wore, most of them from an earlier period. And they have then been taken apart and reconstructed into these squares. When they are set up in the altar, they form as a kind of prayer for that person, and particularly after the person has died, they are a prayer that to make sure that their soul remains in peace. It just so happens that the curtain and the banner that block off that sacred area are also from garments that were at one time worn by the Empress. The whole process here is a process of recycling from the secular into the sacred, and it's a very important part of these imperial convents. So, but what happened was that this didn't turn out to be a very effective, it didn't work very well as altar cloths. And at some point, somebody asked to whether they could display it as an item that the Meiji empress had worn. It's a real treasure because of its relationship to her. And so they sewed it back together into a train, and they put some tucks up on the top and turned it back into a secular item. So we have a question when we start to conserve this: should it be conserved as altar cloths in the end, or as a train? It has a double history. Well, it turned out that there was quite a lot of deterioration, even though it doesn't look like that. There was quite a lot of deterioration in the threads, and so we knew it had to be conserved. We went to a conservation studio in Kyoto called Sengiren that very often does national treasures and very important items. They focus on textiles. So they're a textile conservation studio. And the first thing that you have to do is to document the object, because you want to know where you're coming from. You want to know what kind of deterioration there is, what type of method of conservation, the methodology that you want to use, how you're going to conserve it. But you also want to know where you're coming from so that you can restore it in some form to whatever, where you want it to go. Well, excuse me, the first thing that we found in looking at the garment was that the edges are, I don't know if you can see that the edge of the garment, there's embroidery on here and it ends very abruptly. So the maybe about 3-4 inches along the edge of the train is has no embroidery on it and seems to be different. And as a result, we realized from relating this with other trains, particularly European ones, that probably there was, if you look at the left-hand side at the bottom, you can see that the face cloth was then covered with an edging, and that edging has disappeared now. And between the face cloth and the lining, which would be underneath that, there was probably a padding to make the train a little thicker and to keep its shape a little bit better. Well, what type of deterioration was there? We find that along that edging on the right hand, the picture on the right hand side, you'll see that all along that edging, there's a great deal of loss in and deterioration. Also, where on the left-hand side is a photograph of where the two altar cloths were sewn back together, and that seam is just very difficult. And creases or folds, the pleats at the top, they also incurred quite a lot of deterioration. If we look at the deterioration more closely, these are magnifications of it, you'll see that the warp threads, those are the vertical threads that are running here, the white, thin vertical threads. Many of them have simply totally broken off. And as a result, what you see here running horizontally, which is the weft threads and which form the pattern in the weave, have been exposed. So on the left, you get a real magnification. On the right, you get a little bit greater view of, more distance view of it. And you can see how the weaving of the pattern has brought out the weft threads in certain places. In other places, it dives underneath the warp threads. And particularly everywhere where the weft thread should really be totally covered by the warp in a kind of satin weave, the warp threads are just lying on top there and not held down at all. So when the lining comes off, this thing is going to fall apart. Before, as I said, before actually doing the conservation, there are a lot of really basic questions that one wants to ask. When was the piece made? Where was it made? How was it made? And to figure that out, we look at the garment itself. It's going to talk to us. And in this case, because it's a textile as opposed to a piece of pottery or whatever, we look at how it was tailored and what techniques went into making it. In addition, we have documents from the time, and you have to sort of search for those documents. Sometimes they're obvious, sometimes they're not. They're photographs and they're comparable pieces once you figure out when it was made, pieces that are made either in Japan or in Europe. As I said before, her first garment is very well documented, and we know it was made in Berlin. We also know that she had some dresses made in Paris. So our question was this made in Berlin? Was it made in Paris? Was it made in Japan? What parts of it were made wherever? Well, what was easier to answer was, when was it made? We know it was made after 1887. It's not her first garment because that was red. But it could be any time after that. However, the tailoring of the garment suggests, with the small bustle, if you look at the back, it kind of bulges out over her backside. And but it's not a huge bustle, which was very common in the early 1880s, but it's a kind of reduced bustle. This is typical of the late 1880s, but the bustle goes out completely by the time you get into 1891 or so. So we have a very small window, 1888, 1889, 1890, for when it was made. The peculiarity of the tailoring are these sleeves, which have the crossover on the top, and they happen to be constructed in the same way as the sleeves in her photograph, which again, that photograph was made in 1889. So there's sometime around that late 1880s period. The other aspect of these weird sleeves is that they are larger, wider at the bottom than they are at the top, which is not how one would normally want to do it. So the first thing that we were concerned with was consolidating the textile itself. And as you can see, it's kind of a Rococo design with a very Western motif. The Japanese didn't have this style of roses at all. in them. I want to look a little bit about how it's constructed, because that's going to tell us how we're going to conserve it. Goodness gracious. It is embroidered. It's woven. What you see in the picture here is a totally woven design, and it includes supplementary wefts that have created the colored pattern, plus a white on white pattern. They then added embroidery in certain places made with metal threads, which covered the white areas. So they just used the white areas as the pattern for creating this metallic embroidery. When we took the lining off, it turned out that the embroidery was backed with Japanese paper. You can see there's Japanese writing on it. And that meant that the embroidery was done in Japan. That was a quick solution. However, we also found that there was a great deal of abrasion that was caused between one piece of paper and the next paper that were backing this embroidery. And that abrasion caused a great deal of the loss. And I've sort of put arrows around it in the picture on the right. So you can see how the paper has formed a kind of deterioration. So when we sent it off to the studio, the process is to back this with an appropriately light or heavy silk, dyed in the studio to a color that seems to match it, but it's not going to be visible. And this is called a support silk. The end product will then be lined in some form as well. If you look at here at the bottom right-hand side, you'll see that there's a plastic form. This is specific to the Senguren studio. They've invented it so that they can stitch in straight lines and baste stitch this entire piece with small stitches that will hold the weft, the loose wefts in place. And here they are doing the stitches with needles. You can't even see the needle in her hand, it's so thin. And she's holding down the cloth with her tweezers so that when she brings the needle up again, it doesn't lift the cloth itself. It doesn't lift the fabric. The type of stitches they do, they lay along the same line as the warp threads. It's shown diagonally in this photograph. They lay a thread and then they couch it down with small stitches at intervals. In the end, it looks a little bit like this. It doesn't look great, but it holds the threads in place. And by the time you see a view from farther away, you'll see that one isn't really disturbed by the conservation work, but the pattern itself has gotten a clearer, sharper image. So what do the needles, the tools that are used for this are important. The needles that they use there are handmade. And it turns out that there are very few people who still make handmade needles, because you can industrially make needles much, much more cheaply than hammering these out. But the needles are so thin and so long that the finest of them have to be handmade. There's only one man, I think, who still makes handmade needles in Japan. So what are we going to do when that old man is no longer around? This is a major problem for conservation work. Just for your interest, the needle that's marked up here is the 19th century, is one that was caught inside the garment. And the 18th century needles, just to show you exactly the same form with that tiny little hole, round hole up at the top. A little different from the Western needles. The same story goes for the scissors. Japanese style scissors. They're handmade. The best of them are handmade. There's only one or two people who continue to know how to make handmade scissors, though you can get very cheap industrial made ones that look the same, but they don't work the same. The thread itself is very important. They dye the thread in the studio, and then they take on the right hand, very far right, you'll get one strand of that thread, which is actually made up of maybe 10 or 12 individual strands. They'll take two of them out and hand ply them together in order to do the work. The threads they use, with my ancient eyes, I can hardly see them. The Empress herself was very involved in silk production, both in the industrialization of it, and it's one way in which Japan modernized, but also she established a sericulture right within the imperial palace, which is still used today. I mean, the Empress today still continues that sericulture. In addition to the fabric itself, we had to do conservation work on the metallic threads. As you can see, they started to fall off. The threads that are holding down these metallic coils were very fragile and were breaking off, and then all the pieces start falling off. So those are, on the left, you see the coils, on the right, you see the little spangles or sequins that have fallen off from them. Everything that falls off is preserved. It might be reused, it might be used for research, or it's simply preserved with the garment itself. There are, these are all Western style, well, four of them. Three of them are Western style things that the Japanese did not work with until the Meiji Restoration. They're coils or faceted coils, sequins, flattened out coils, basically, and Japan thread. The leaves there are done with this Japan thread, which is an old form that they've used in Japan for a long time. The embroidery is constructed over this kind of cardboard-like thick mud paper is how I translated it, dorogami. But in the West it would be cardboard or felt or some possibly leather, that then the coils are laid over them. So you get the coils laid over the some kind of structure that raises them up into a three-dimensional form. And then right in the middle of these leaves or forms, you have a series of sequins that are then held down again by pearls. So that needle has to go through, on the sides, it only has to go through the fabric. But on the top, those top ones, the needle has to go through the coils, the mud paper, which is hardened over the 130 years that it's been around, through the fabric, through the Japanese, 2 layers of Japanese paper to the back. And it turned out that it was very, very tough to do that. Well, we looked at a book that was published in 1770 by a French embroiderer to find a technique for doing this. And he describes the back stitch and what he does, and basically followed that ancient technique in trying to stabilize and these things. So you see here, there's a broken thread on the right-hand side, and some sequins are missing. In order to fix that, what they ended up doing was to put one of those pearl coils that had fallen off onto a thread, and to restitch it back into, to stabilize what we have there, and then to pull that loose thread that's standing up back to the back of the fabric. And in order to do that, they were inspired by the tools in that French book on embroidery and created this tool that could create a hole so they could stitch from the top to the bottom, because bringing your needle up from the bottom, it was very hard to stick a needle through all that thick paper. And if they put the needle up from the bottom, it would push up the coils. So they had to do all the work from the top down, And to do that, they then looped a thread around that, pulled it to the back, and tied all the loose threads together at the back. In the end, we see on the left what it was like before, and on the right, how reusing those pieces that had dropped off, they were able to recreate something like the original form. One of the things that we did was we looked at the colors and thought, these are awfully dark. We wonder what they're made of. And we got them chemically analyzed. And it turned out that they're made of copper amalgams that have been either gold plated or silver plated. And the silver plated parts have then tarnished and turned various colors of black or rust. And they also found traces of mercury, which, if I have time at the end, I'll tell you what the implications are from that. So this is what the embroidery looks like today. Probably in the past, all those really dark colors were silver and very, very light. So the impression that we have of it is very different if we start to think of these dark areas as being really quite light. And that takes us to the bodice. How are we going to deal with the bodice? The Japanese were really no problem about dealing with a flat piece like those altar cloths, because they just stitch them up, down, straight, up and down, vertically. But what do you do with a three-dimensional piece? And we've worried about this a great deal. Well, luckily, the lining to the bodice turned out to be quite sturdy. We could take it all apart and then sew it all back together. That's something the Japanese do a lot with their own kimono when they do conservation work on it. But there's no guarantee that you could sew something of this sort back together exactly the way it had been sewn in the beginning. And one of the things that Western conservators are very adamant about is that in the original, every single element counts and every stitch counts, which and indeed, one place where if you see up in the right-hand image, one place where the seams were kind of coming apart, we can see the threads, and those are 2-ply silk threads. And one of the Westerner conservators who looked at this said, we don't use those threads for sewing in the West. We use 3-ply threads. And so we began to think, okay, this was also tailored in Japan. On the left, you see the inside of the Empress's gown. On the right, you see a gown made in Berlin at the time when she ordered those first things. You can see the construction is rather different. In particular, the Empress's gown lacks a waistband, an internal waistband which would keep it in form. And also, when somehow feels that whoever made it was not exactly sure how to deal with the seams. And so they're very irregular. In addition, we have the bones. We need to do something about the bones. But outside of doing something about the sacks that hold the bones, we decided that we were not going to do work on that, but rather we would put it on a archival mount. We would build an archival mount to exactly its form, and therefore leave it so it doesn't have creases, doesn't get exposed to the air on the inside, and make sure that it's boxed properly. So we are going totally into how to preserve it as opposed to how to conserve it. So we get back to where was it made? When was it made? We sort of answered, but the conservation itself changed our minds from thinking it was basically a Western garment to almost the entire piece being made in Japan. The embroidery is definitely done in Japan. The metallic threads are Japanese, and I'll talk about that if you're interested. The tailoring we found was in Japan, and the fabric is most likely made in Japan. So here we get back to regeneration, preserving the old textile for the future. What should be preserved? This is definitely historically, aesthetically, and personally worthwhile, and therefore should have been preserved. And then the question we came up was, okay, so when you ended up, should this be a train or should this be an altar cloth? And how should we do it? We found that with the bodice, we emphasized the storage and the preservation. With the train, we stabilized it through conservation. And the missing skirt, we could or could not create or renew, remake, invent a skirt to go with it. There were various challenges. And okay, I think my time is essentially up. So I just want to say we kind of went through, and you could see that there were times when we looked at past techniques and invented new ways from inspired by the past techniques and used old materials and new materials in order to do this conservation work. Thank you very much. I think it's time for questions. So I am going to end the speech here. Yes.
Thank you so much. It's absolutely fascinating. We have some questions. I'm going to start with them and then have some of my own too. So the first question concerns the paper that was on the back of the fabric. And the question is, did the ink on the paper cause any rust or other damage?
Oh, that's a very good question. And the answer is basically no. Those papers are reused papers, and probably, well, actually, we've been able to decipher where they came from and how they, therefore, essentially how old they were. They have both a printed ledger line on them. They turned out to be, what you say, account papers that were used for building a wooden ship for a military ship. And that was built maybe 10 years before they were reused then in making this garment, maybe 5 to 10 years before that. So the ink had settled completely. And because we haven't had any water damage on it, the ink has not also had any impact on the garment itself, luckily.
Could that have happened just in terms of the atmospheric elements once it was repurposed into, say, the altar cloth? I mean, there could have been damage any step of the way, right?
Very, very much. It could have been placed on the altar, a little bit of water had spilled on it, and the ink seeped out onto the cloth itself.
Okay. Right. Are there any methods or plans that exist to preserve techniques and skills like the ones needed to create the handmade needles and scissors you mentioned?
That's also a very good question. Japan is very concerned about losing artisans and artisans' crafts. And they try very hard to support old crafts and also to regenerate, to recreate old crafts in the process of copying, or reproduction copy processes. The biggest let's say the most problematic are the ones that will bring no money at all. They cannot turn into professions. How many needles do you need? You know, and how many people need needles that are almost invisible to see? Not very many. So those are and they go across the entire society, the baseline of tools and materials that are made, you know, like making nails. They're handmade nails that are used in building Shinto shrines and things. And who's going to make handmade nails anymore? Do you know what they do with those? When they take apart the shrine in order to do the reconstruction or conservation work, they save every single nail. And they rehammer it and reuse it and do it again because they're losing those crafts. There are other people who have there are various things where the artisans themselves, not the people who are making those baseline tools, but the next level up start to make tools. So if we need that, we're going to have to make that tool ourselves.
How about, could you discuss the implications of the traces of mercury you mentioned in passing?
Okay, so the traces of mercury, basically they're telling us that the gold plating and silver plating was done with a technique that has been around in Japan for 1,000 some years. And also in Europe, it's a typical technique of where you use the mercury in order to paste or make the plating adhere to the copper. But by the end of the 19th century, the Europeans had already developed an electrolyte so that they immerse the metal into a soluble material, and then they use electrolyte techniques in order to do the gilding and the gold plating and silver plating. So that is our key to saying those were probably made by a Japanese who was trying to imitate to recreate the process of making those coils by looking at European things and using techniques that he already knew.
So what was the difference between the immersive technique and the use of copper or, were they identical or were there?
In the end, you get a gold-plated something or other, but the electrolyte system plates it much more securely, probably. And I mean, I don't know the science behind this, but it's also clear, I mean, mercury is toxic. And so today we don't really want to use mercury in order to do gold plating.
Have other gowns been conserved or only this one? And if only this one, why this one is one question. And kind of piggyback, also, what happened to the traditional gown shown in the older photograph?
We don't know what happened to that gown. Oh, you mean the traditional gown shown in the old, well,
right.
I don't know what happened to that one particular traditional gown, but another one very similar to that you saw in the altar, curtains had been returned into the altar curtains. Other of her older traditional gowns have been preserved in museums, particularly the Meiji Museum, which is devoted to the Meiji emperor and empress. So some of them have been preserved. There was a common thing that and this is both in the West and in Japan, in the court, if you are through wearing something, you might pass it on to one of your ladies in waiting or somebody that you care a great deal about. And that's one of the reasons that she passed things on to these imperial convents as well. So the ladies in waiting, they receive these garments and you don't really want to wear them, so you keep them as treasures, and maybe in the end you also give them to a temple so that they can serve as prayers for the woman you worked for. There are various ways in which things entered into the convents. Other pieces, other gowns of hers that have been preserved. I think for preserving these, she was such an important figure in so many different ways. She suddenly comes out of the background and turns out to be a real leader of Japan in the modernization. She founds the Japanese, or at least is integral in creating the Japanese Red Cross, and she founds schools. She funds people to get women to get education abroad as well as in Japan. I mean, she's really out there trying to create a modern Japanese society. And she does a lot of work in inspiring and supporting artisans and helping them to convert from their earlier style clientele to a new clientele, which is also focused on selling things to the West. So she's she's a very important figure. Mm-hmm. Therefore, anything related to her is important. But in addition to that, this is the oldest of her garments that is actually preserved. And yes, there are two other full-style court robes, and both of them have had quite a lot of conservation work done on them. One of them, and both of them are they're in school museums. And they come from a later period in her life. So this is the earliest one. In that sense, it's very important.
How common is it that you have to make a choice in what form to conserve an object, i.e. choosing to preserve the dress as a dress or an altar cloth? And how do you make this decision?
It's very difficult. Ultimately, how common is that? I think it's probably pretty common. Not as common with dresses, but it's very common with other altar cloths. And there are many, many altar cloths, and kimono were remade, kosode were remade into altar cloths all the time. And we are constantly, there's the question, should we keep this as an altar cloth, or should we recreate it into the form of kosode so that we have a sense of the styles that go along with that period when it was made? So that's a big question for earlier pieces, not so much for these later pieces. What was the other part of your question?
How do you make the decision was the question. Like, how common is that decision, and how do you
right. Ultimately, the decision for this piece has a lot to do with what we want to do with it later. And when I say we, actually, it's the convent. You know, whatever the convent wants, the convent will get. It's their piece. However, they put it back into a train in order to display it. The question is, can it ever be displayed again in its gown form? And if it can't, there's a lot of reason to just putting it back without sewing it together again, to keeping it as two separate pieces as altar cloths, and to keep the history with the altar cloth backing of the altar cloth lining on it, to keep that history intact with the pieces. But we've only come to that decision after the convent decided that the atmospheric control in their convent was not really very good for its preservation. It took a while for them to decide that. And to agree that it would be very good to put this into a museum and have it stored in the museum. So the piece, rather than going back to the convent, which is what we thought at the beginning of the conservation project, will now go to Kyoto National Museum and be preserved there in and because of that, the way we think about it changed a great deal.
Oh, interesting. So on a related note, who paid for this preservation and what were the politics of choosing to preserve this particular piece?
Okay, so we at the Medieval Japanese Institute, in one of our major jobs is to find pieces for conservation and then to get them conserved. And we go through a foundation, the Hirayama Zaidan, I forget what its proper name is. And there's a foundation, and that foundation, luckily, because of various reasons, we're very, very fortunate to get a little niche in that foundation for items that are related to these imperial convents. And that foundation then goes out and finds a funder, or we find a funder. In other words, they work as a kind of cachet or interplay. They don't pay for it, but if you have several donations, then they will pocket all the donations and then recycle them for us. So we go to the foundation goes to other foundations or other donors, collects the money from the donors, and then when the conservation is, they send us a bill. They send the bill to the convent sends the bill to us, we send the bill to the foundation pays the convent pays the conservation people.
All right. We have
So
time.
we make sure that all of this happens.
Right. So the money is sort of recycled and circulated too.
Exactly.
We have time for one more question, although there are others, and it is this. What is the importance of speaking the language of the country where a garment is made, to making the importance of speaking the language to making decisions about the conservation and preservation process?
Wow.
Yeah, the language of the country where the garment's made.
Okay, well, of course, it's very useful to be able to speak the local language. However, would the Japanese have to be able to speak German when they ordered a piece from Germany? I think that's where we have to take this question. Say the garment turned out to be made in Germany as opposed to in Japan. Would the conservators in Japan have to be able to speak German in order to figure out how to conserve it? And I think the answer is both. That is, they would definitely want to look into ways in which Germans did tailors, where they got their fabrics from, how they dealt with things at the time. But if there was any information in Japanese, they could read that all in Japanese, or they could ask somebody to translate it. And definitely in doing this project, we have called on experts in Germany, in England, in the United States. We've had a whole international team. I couldn't possibly have come to many of the conclusions I did without the help of my international team.
Great. Well, our time is up. Thank you for an utterly fascinating talk. I also just want to thank our audience for your rich and precise questions. You really helped to make the last part of our convening a dialogue. So thank you, virtual audience. Thank you, Monica, Bethe. It was really a pleasure and an honor to hear you share your knowledge with us. And good night to everybody. When you leave, if you could take our exit survey, we would be grateful. So good night, and see you again at the virtual or live IHC. Bye-bye.